The atmosphere of the planet Dorian was cloaked in a black veil amidst burning metal and exploding bombs. A blood-red sky made the brutality of the battle more apparent with each passing minute. The human headquarters were overshadowed by the towering silhouettes of Kravka ships rising on the horizon. As Arlen lowered the visor of his helmet, he briefly closed his eyes as if trying to block out the screams of war. The breath of death was felt everywhere on Dorian. The battlefield had turned into a living hell, with the sound of weapons firing, soldiers' cries, and the terrifying roars of the enormous Borax creatures. The Kravka warriors had broken their agreement with the humans and launched an invasion. But the attack humanity had been expecting did not only come from the Kravka army. The Borax creatures, which the Kravka used as pets, had gone wild under the tension of battle. These 4-meter-tall creatures were covered in thick, armor-like skin, with claws strong enough to tear through metal. The fury and power in their eyes reflected the nature of a beast. When the Kravka lost control of these creatures, they didn't know what to do. The Borax were attacking everything in sight, friend and foe alike. Arlen was on the front lines. In the trenches dug into Dorian's dry soil, he was trying to get his soldiers into a defensive formation. The commands echoing over the radio reflected the ever-changing situation. The Borax are out of control. Be careful, they're attacking. Kell, who stood next to Arlen, couldn't take his eyes off the chaos on the horizon. "Commander," he said with worry, "these creatures could wipe us out." Arlen looked out at the battlefield once more. The Borax were toppling tanks and tearing soldiers apart with their claws. Both human and Kravka troops had nowhere to run. The colossal creatures' every step echoed through the ground with a deafening thud. The air was filled with the sounds of weapons and explosions, but the roars of the Borax were just as loud. Laser weapons were useless against their thick skin. The more the creatures were shot, the angrier they became. Arlen knew that attacking the enemy lines was impossible right now. Instead of fighting the Kravka army, he sensed that trying to understand these massive creatures would be a better approach. But most of the soldiers were paralyzed with fear. The Borax, despite being hit with machine gun fire, kept advancing. A group of human soldiers found themselves face to face with one of the towering Borax right outside the trench. The creature roared and charged at them. One of the soldiers, caught in the massive claws, let out a piercing scream that echoed across the battlefield as his life was taken. Kell turned his eyes away from the gruesome sight, looking at Arlen with desperation. "Commander, our weapons aren't working against these monsters. This could be the end of us." As Arlen continued to observe the Borax, he noticed something. Beneath the creature's aggressive behavior lay a hint of fear. Their eyes, filled with rage and chaos, also held a kind of helplessness. Arlen threw his helmet to the ground and slung his weapon off his shoulder, dropping it as well. The soldiers and Kravka warriors, seeing this, stared at him in shock. "Commander, what are you doing?" Kell's voice trembled. Arlen began walking toward the creature, fearlessly. The Borax, eyes fixed on him, let out a deep growl, poised to attack. Arlen stood before the beast and spoke in a calm voice. "I'm not here to harm you." The Borax, as if understanding his words, hesitated for a moment. It retracted its claws and lowered its massive head toward Arlen. In the creature's eyes, for just a second, there was a glimmer of calm. A profound silence fell across the battlefield. Even the blasts of lasers seemed not powerful enough to disrupt the weight of the moment. Kell whispered in astonishment, "How is this even possible?" Arlen, still gazing deeply into the creature's eyes, responded, "These creatures aren't wild beasts. They're just as trapped in this chaos as we are." Arlen knelt beside the Borax and continued to soothe it. As the creature's warm breath hit Arlen's skin, the once furious giant was now calm. One by one, the other Borax began to stop attacking and approached the humans around them. The Kravka warriors watched in horror and disbelief. The Borax, known to be uncontrollable, had been completely pacified by Arlen's approach. The human capacity for empathy and mercy, just as strong as their combat prowess, was something the Kravka had never expected. Arlen stood up and issued a new command through his radio. "Lower your weapons. We're not fighting them." For a brief moment, the battle had stopped. The humans had discovered that these Borax were not just beasts to be fought, but beings that could be approached with understanding and compassion. The chaos on the battlefield had suddenly subsided, but this silence was filled with tense anticipation. Despite their savage instincts, the Borax creatures, calmed by Arlen's bold and compassionate approach, seemed to take a deep breath and began restlessly pacing around. The Kravka warriors exchanged bewildered glances, while the human soldiers, too, had lowered their weapons, trying to comprehend what was happening. Arlen was still standing face to face with one of the Borax, his eyes locked on the creature's deep, terrifying yet strangely enigmatic gaze. The massive beast roared as it took another step toward him, shaking the ground. Every movement of its muscular body struck the earth like a blow. But this time, Arlen didn't back away. He took a deep breath and, with slow, calm steps, moved closer to the creature. His heart was racing, but not a trace of fear showed on his face. The creature seemed surprised by Arlen's courage. It lifted its huge, clawed arm and brought it down just beside Arlen, the ground trembling beneath its weight. Yet, this action wasn't threatening. It felt more like a warning. Arlen knelt down and slowly reached out to touch the creature's front paw. The Borax sniffed his hand, and a deep rumble echoed as its large eyes softened. It was no longer a threat, but a sign of trust. From a distance, Kravka leader Vrylon watched the scene unfold. "This is impossible," he muttered. He turned to his officers with a bewildered look. "The Borax cannot be controlled. They were never trained that way. They only attack. They don't obey." But what Arlen had done was something even the Borax themselves had never experienced. The other Borax, sensing Arlen's approach, began to calm down one by one. The way the humans approached them had soothed these creatures, who usually responded to aggression with aggression. Still beside the Borax, Arlen repeated his order over the radio. "Everyone, stay calm. Don't attack. They aren't our enemies. They're just scared." A group of soldiers, though struggling to believe Arlen's words, trusted their commander. They, too, lowered their weapons and began to cautiously approach the Borax. Kel, directing the soldiers around him, took a deep breath. As he came face to face with the enormous eyes of the Borax in front of him, he had to fight off his fear. Slowly, he knelt down and placed his weapon on the ground. The Borax in front of Kel stood still for a few seconds, then began to approach him with heavy, deliberate steps. The sound of its claws tearing through the earth sent chills down Kel's spine, but he didn't retreat. The creature leaned in closer, its deep growl now more subdued. It wasn't a threat anymore. It resembled the labored breathing of a frightened animal. With a mixture of fear and courage, Kel extended his hand toward the creature. "I don't want to hurt you," he whispered. The Borax sniffed his hand, then lowered its massive head, resting it right next to Kel's knee. Kel, stunned by this sudden gesture of trust, almost recoiled but stopped himself. The Borax had shown him trust. Other Borax creatures, too, had stopped fighting and were now approaching the humans, observing them more closely. The soldiers' fear was slowly giving way to a strange curiosity. They had never considered that there might be another way to interact with these creatures besides combat. Arlen approached Kel and observed the bond he had established with the Borax. "This is it," he said quietly. "We don't have to fight. They're just as scared as we are." At that moment, a group of Kravka soldiers from the front lines began advancing toward where Arlen and Kel stood. Acting on Kravka leader Vrylon's orders, They intended to assess the situation and send a message to the humans. However, as they saw the Borax's reaction to the humans, they were at a loss for what to do. One of the Kravka soldiers muttered, "Leader Vrylon, the Borax are being controlled by the humans. How is this possible?" The battlefield, which just a few hours earlier had echoed with explosions and death cries, now fell into a tense silence. The Borax creatures stood alongside the human soldiers, their massive bodies almost like protective sentinels. The Kravka soldiers, meanwhile, stood frozen in shock, unsure of what to do. The tide of the battle had turned, thanks to the unexpected empathy the humans had shown toward the Borax. Arlen fixed his gaze on Kravka leader Vrylon. The leader, who had claimed the Borax were uncontrollable, now realized even his own army didn't know how to respond. A few Kravka officers gathered anxiously around him. As Arlen saw their confusion, he knew the time had come to end this war. But would the Kravka retreat so easily? As Arlen approached Vrylon, he gave a final order over the radio. "Do not fire. Lower your weapons. We are here to make peace." The human soldiers, following Arlen's command, stood cautiously around the Borax. The Kravka soldiers, however, remained on edge. Vrylon's simmering anger kept them from standing down. But Arlen stepped forward to break the tension. "Vrylon," Arlen called out loudly, "there are no winners in this war anymore. Both your army and mine are exhausted, wounded. Even the Borax know it." Vrylon narrowed his eyes, glaring at Arlen. His mind wrestled between two options: attack and annihilate the humans completely, or stop this war. But Arlen's approach made his decision more difficult. Vrylon placed his hand on the hilt of his sword, a final act of defiance. Arlen noticed the indecision in Vrylon's eyes. With a moment of hesitation, he stepped closer to stop Vrylon from drawing his sword. "What will you gain from this war, Vrylon? You couldn't control your creatures, but we understood them. It's not just about power. Sometimes you need something beyond that. I hope you had a good time. If you liked my story, do not forget to comment and subscribe to my channel. Goodbye. See you in the next story.